this video has absolutely no business happening at 1 o'clock in the morning or being about the person that it's going to be about, because I spent a month researching something else, even shooting on location, and then finding a golden nugget of intrigue that links it back to another video that I've already done. And yet, this morning I got intercepted by possibly the most interesting person in the whole of history. So it has to be about her, and her name is Nadine Hwang. Now, Hwang is sometimes spelled H-W-A-N-G and sometimes it's H-U-O-N-G, but somewhere in there is a Hwang. And she was born in Madrid in Spain on the 3rd of March 1902 to a Chinese diplomat father called Luha Hwang and a Belgian mother called Juliette Bruta Gilliard. And she had a really fascinating childhood. Because of her dad's job, she was moving around a lot. So she was born in Madrid, but her sister was born in Havana. And then in 1913, her dad got a job in Beijing as the EU Foreign Affairs Minister. But she was kind of hanging around with all these elites, but she was moving in these ways that she was speaking a lot of languages. She spoke Castilian and her native French, as well as English and Chinese. But she went from being in a Catholic nunnery for school, where she was learning a lot of discipline, to going to a school remotely. She was literally like a distance learner from the American Hamilton College, and she studied law, but she also learned to drive really young and even learned to fly really young. It could be possible that because she was raised in this way, where she was so far outside of the norm of hanging out with all these elites and traveling so much and having such a diverse range of cultures to reflect on, that she didn't then have to comply to a norm, because she was so far out of the norm that then she could just explore more freely and more boldly. So that might be the reason why she allowed herself to, get interested in driving and flying and all these different cultures, but also in kind of gender bending a bit. She liked to be outside of the norm in what she dressed. So she liked like tailored clothes that were a bit more masculine looking, which I hate using the term masculine for clothing because it feels so ridiculous. Like, clothes are just clothes. I don't think that when clothes came around, people were like, oh yes, this is masculine, this is feminine. I think, the cavemen were just like, it's warm, wear it. And I hope that's potentially the direction that we're going in long term, that we move away from this idea of gendered clothing, and also that the gender of clothing is entirely based on culture and time. It's there was a time when boys all wore dresses and that was part of one culture, and there's a time where men all wear dresses now. It's whatever. But in the cultures, she was exposed to so many cultures. In the cultures that she was in at the time, as in a French school, a French nunnery in Beijing, there was one way of dressing, and then in Havana there was another, and then specifically when she's referred to as a cross-dresser, she was living in Paris as an adult woman. And so it's all comparative, it's all compared to the social norm of the space, and she liked to sort of move outside of the social norm. And that might be because she never had to consider the social norm, because no one expected her to fit in because she had such an abnormal childhood. Or it might be that she knew the social norm and she liked to play with it and she liked to be outside that box. Don't know, but either way, she was into tailored clothes. So that's not the thing that makes her outrageously interesting. And what I'm about to tell you is outrageously interesting and still doesn't make her the most outrageously interesting person of history. So she was the daughter of a Chinese diplomat, and she was going to an international French nunnery school and then went on to study law, distance learning at the American Hamilton College. And she was getting into polo and cricket and equestrianism, which is riding horses, but so fancy, it just gets sort of weird and dancey. And she was like doing her gender bendy thing. And then she became the press secretary in 1927 for Pan Fu, who was the premier to the Beian Chinese government. And then in 1929, she became his private secret secretary. Zhang Zhouchang was the first Chinese leader, premier, warlord, who actually allowed women to be part of the military forces, and they met, and she was like, I got you. I'm dead bold. I got you. And so she was given this like honorary Air Force colonel position, and also became a staff liaison in the military forces. Like, women for the first time in China were being part of the forces. But then they could see, because of her diplomatic capacities, both from what she'd learned from her dad, but also the connections that she'd been imbibed with, and her exceptional language skills, like she was a native French speaker, it was really useful to send her to the EU to try and bolster and encourage relations, both like trading relations, but also diplomatic and like political relations with EU countries. So in 1933, she was sent to Paris to live and give lectures about China and kind of bolster interest in China, as well as actually trying to create political relations and encourage these like trade exchanges and this kind of thing. So she was there slowly on a mission to get to America. So she was going through Europe, and the goal was that she would eventually get to America and that she would start to create these political links. So she was kind of a tool of connection. But she was way too interesting just to be doing diplomatic and political work. So while she was there, she actually started to moonlight as a chauffeur and a secretary for Natalie Clifton Barney. Now, I probably should do a video about Natalie Clifton Barney. I haven't, because I feel like she is very well known. But essentially, she was like the socialite star of Paris. She knew everyone, and she was constantly hosting parties for the Paris literati. And Nadine and her ended up in a lesbian relationship. So Nadine was working as a secretary and driving her around, but they were also having a massive sapphic affair, which was very saucy. And Natalie was very outspoken. She was very outspoken from an early age about being open as a lesbian. And I don't know how open Nadine was, but I feel like Nadine was less open and more just had never been closed. And this is kind of what I mean with Nadine, is that she grew up so far out of the social norms that she seems to just have the privilege of not really caring about not fitting in. So something in that of her being very obviously androgynous, and if you see photos of her, she is quite obviously androgynous, gives her the ability to sort of be accepted as an inevitable lesbian. So they had quite an open public affair. However, one thing that annoys me, and I want to just like history correct this, in the significant relationships that are tagged to Natalie, so if you look up Natalie Clifton Barney, her significant lesbian relationships leaves out Nadine Hwang, who was way more interesting than any of the people who are mentioned. Like Nadine not only came from this like radically fascinating outside of the norm background, but she then cultivated a fantastically interesting life. It gets even more interesting beyond that. She didn't even stop there, which is just like amazing. So just to check in with how insanely interesting she is, she grew up as the daughter of a diplomat, traveling around the world, speaking multiple languages, went to a French nunnery, and then went to distance learn at an American college to get her law degree, but then decided to learn to fly, so joined the Air Force of China as one of the first females in the Chinese military, after having been the press secretary and then the secret secretary to the premier of China, and then was sent off to Paris, integrated into the literati while she was giving lectures about China to encourage international relations between China and Europe, eventually trying to get to America so that she could encourage relationships between China and America. And while she was in Paris, she happened to have a relationship with one of the biggest socialites in Paris at the time, and managed to totally integrate herself into the most powerful group of authors Paris had to offer at the time. And then she moved to the south of France and began to do her most heroic work. I think there was one thing I read which like referenced her as like the Chinese Joan of Arc, which I think is going a bit far, but she is genuinely that fascinating. She decides, you know what, I'm gonna go and be the most interesting person in history. So during the Nazi invasion of France, she is living in Saint-Jean-de-Luz, which is like a coastal part of southern France, and it's just across the Pyrenees from Spain. So she starts helping refugees escape. She's kind of safely getting refugees out of France and into neutral Spain. And this act of heroism is inevitably what brings her to the Ravensbrück concentration camp, because the Nazis arrested her, captured her, and sent her to the Ravensbrück concentration camp for her resistance activities. And this is not where her story gets any less interesting. So she's sent to this concentration camp by the Nazis, and they force her to wear a red triangle, which means political prisoner. And she is made to do forced labor for Siemens, the company. Something that we forget is that concentration camps were not just a Nazi invention. There had been concentration camps that, the Brits had concentration camps. Like in the Boer War, they had used concentration camps. It wasn't a Nazi invention, but the Nazis were particularly wicked and heartless, particularly humiliating. They took concentration camps, which are a completely degrading thing anyway, and turned it into something deadly, completely dehumanizing, and stripping humans literally of the energy of their bones as well as their souls. She was going through the experience of complete physical exhaustion, her spirit being utterly crushed and being humiliated by the situation. But then the officers on Christmas Day in 1944 wanted some entertainment. So they forced the prisoners who had talent to perform for them. Now, there was no lights used in the barracks at the time because they didn't want to spare resources, I guess. So there was an opera singer at the end of the barrack, and in the dark, Nadine was listening to this opera singer sing. So she was in this crowd of prisoners, and there was somewhere way off in the darkness this opera singer singing, whilst the guards were sort of using this as their own entertainment. And on this Christmas Day experience, the singer was supposed to be singing French Christmas carols because this was in the French quarter of the Ravensbrück concentration camp. And Nadine called out into the darkness, "Sing something from Madame Butterfly." And the opera singer responded by singing Un bel di vedremo, which is from Madame Butterfly. And the two of them, over the distance and over the darkness, melted into a moment of melody. And afterwards, Nadine went up to this opera singer and kissed her on each cheek. And it was the first time they'd moved into the light and they saw each other. And so this was where the next part of the story begins. Amazingly, right at the moment that I was about to divulge the most well-known part of the story, the part of the story that should just be kept in everybody's heart as a seed of love to come, my phone overheated. So we'll have to go from here. But so they were in the dark. There was this opera singer somewhere in the darkness singing this beautiful aria for Madame Butterfly. They go outside. Nadine finds this opera singer and kisses her on both cheeks. And the opera singer is so moved by this that she remembers it and she writes it in her diary about the beautiful shape of Nadine's eyes and the softness of her cheeks. She takes in her face and she's so moved by her. And it's the first moment of love bursting open into something that can germinate and grow and then find roots. And that opera singer was called Nelly Musset Vos, and she was born on the 10th of July 1906 in Belgium. And she'd been an opera singer, but then she'd also become a resistance fighter, and that's how she got arrested. She was arrested for her resistance work and then brought to Ravensbrück. And then this is how they meet, through music. And the two of them end up having a relationship in the concentration camp. They refuse to give up love. They refuse to give up the dignity of romance. They refuse to let go of their humanity. They don't care that they're being worked nearly to death. They don't care that they have nothing beautiful around them except each other. They fall entirely into each other's image and soul. And they start this wonderful life, even in a concentration camp. They find wonder in each other, and they are the greatest lesson of what it means to be human, of that we don't need anything around us to find the love within each other and grow it. Then they end up getting separated for a while because Nelly is sent off to another concentration camp, perhaps as punishment because the two of them had found happiness in each other. I don't know. But then they are both rescued by the Swedish Red Cross, and they end up finding each other and they start their life together. Now, this is something that I think is braver than we give credit for, because there wasn't a rhetoric at the time of two women living their life openly gay, and especially two women from such different backgrounds. So they end up living in Caracas, Venezuela, and saying that they're each other's cousins, and they don't even tell their families about this. So there's actually a whole documentary about Nelly's granddaughter discovering this way after Nelly's death, because they had no idea. And this might be the reason why Nelly and Nadine were actually buried in separate graves, despite the fact that they lived out their lives together. They chose to be together. They were each other's significant person, and yet they weren't buried together. And I think that's because there weren't provisions made for things that weren't spoken about. So they were living in Caracas, Venezuela. And I had a little bit of a heart moment where it was like, oh, that's moved me in a very deep way, because the only photo I've seen of them together was from Caracas, Venezuela in 1961, which is the year my mother was born. And she was born in Caracas, Venezuela in 1961, and is a non-binary person. She uses female pronouns, but also they them pronouns, and her legal prefix is non-binary and is a very non-binary person. And part of me wishes there was a story there that was like, oh, my mom got to experience these two happy women, one of whom's quite non-binary, living together, and that influenced her notion about what could be possible for her own happiness. But I don't think that happened, or if it did, I definitely have no evidence of it. I haven't dared ask my grandmother, did you ever meet Nelly and Nadine? Maybe that did happen. But whatever it was, where they were living in Caracas, Venezuela, wasn't actually that far from where my mom was living. So it is possible. But my mom would have been very small. Like, she was literally born in 1961. So she would have been really, really small if it was then. But I like to think that something in the air imbibed them with the freedom to be themselves, and gave my mom the courage to inevitably be herself too. But they weren't open about it. They did say that they were cousins, and in fact, Nadine ended up getting very, very sick and had to go on really strong medication. And they ended up moving back to Nelly's native Belgium for the sake of Nadine getting healthcare treatment, because she was pretty sick and she had to be on some very strong medication. But in 1972, on the 16th of February, she ended up passing away from a massive stroke. And Nelly stayed in Brussels for the rest of her life and ended up passing away on the 4th of February, 1987. But they'd actually lived together in Venezuela for 20 years. They really had put down roots there, and then they were only moving for the sake of Nadine getting better healthcare. And I think reflecting on the role that freedom and international freedom played in these women's life is really important, especially nowadays. Nowadays, especially seeing things like ICE happening in the US, and border control getting more radical here in the EU, or exiling them from countries. Sometimes we're deporting them to countries they've never been to. It getting more and more difficult for people to get passports and to be able to travel freely, and the fact that your phone is being monitored, and that there's more and more biometrics being required at borders. When we are doing that, we are violating the natural truth that people are not just a political border. They aren't defined by a nation. They are naturally international. Just because they were born somewhere doesn't mean anything about them. And when we limit them because of the place that they were born or the place that they happen to live, we violate the interconnected humanity of us all by telling the story over and over again that we are the borders that we are blocked in by. The happiness of these two women was dependent on the fact that they were able to be their international selves, travel widely, have wide networks from different countries, support people who needed to escape to different countries, and then to move for the sake of their own healthcare. Why not see that when we become international, when we become totally free to explore languages the world love, we become more expansive and we can defy even the worst terrors like concentration camps. That is the ultimate gift of freedom. So let us all be as bold and explorative as Nadine, but also let us remind ourselves that our anti-fragility in our powers, in our passions, in our loves, comes from not bordering ourselves in. So why should we do that to anyone else?